The morning they saw him, they didn't recognize him. Let that settle for a second. The same men who walked with him for years, ate with him, watched him heal, teach, argue, laugh, stood face to face with him after the resurrection, and didn't know who he was. How does that happen? How do you fail to recognize someone you followed with your entire life? Was it shock, grief, wishful thinking, or was something else going on? Because when you read the accounts carefully, really carefully, you start to notice a pattern that's hard to ignore. Not once, not twice, multiple times in different places with different people, Jesus appears, and the people closest to him don't recognize him. So the question is simple. What changed? Let's start with one of the most famous encounters. 2 disciples walking on the road to Emmaus. This is after the crucifixion, after the burial, after the rumors of an empty tomb. They're confused, disoriented, trying to make sense of everything. And then a man joins them. He walks beside them, talks with them, explains scripture to them, spends hours in conversation. And they don't recognize him. Not a flicker, not a moment of wait, is that? Nothing. Now stop and think about that. These weren't strangers. These were followers. People who had seen his face, heard his voice, watched his movements. So what would have to change for them to spend hours walking with him and not know who he is? The text gives a strange explanation. It says their eyes were kept from recognizing him. But what does that mean? Was something blocking their perception? Or was there something fundamentally different about what they were looking at? Because recognition isn't just spiritual, it's physical. We recognize people by their faces, their posture, their voice, their presence. So if none of that triggered recognition, what does that suggest? Then comes a moment that breaks the tension. They sit down to eat. He takes bread, breaks it, and suddenly everything clicks. They recognize him. And just as quickly he disappears. Gone. Not walks away. Not fades into the distance. Disappears. Now ask yourself something. If this was just the same physical body, restored, why would recognition come through an action instead of appearance? And how does someone vanish mid-presence? Let's move to another scene. The shoreline. Early morning. The disciples are fishing. They see a man standing on the shore. He calls out to them, gives them instructions, performs what looks like another miracle with the fish, and still they don't recognize him. Again, same pattern. Conversation first, recognition later. Only after something familiar happens do they realize who he is. And even then, the text says something strange. None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" Because they knew it was the Lord. Read that again. They knew it was him, but they still felt the need to ask. Why? What kind of presence creates certainty and confusion at the same time? And then there's Mary Magdalene. She's at the tomb. She sees Jesus standing there, and she thinks he's a gardener, not just unrecognized, misidentified. She's close enough to speak to him, close enough to hear his voice, close enough to look directly at him. And still she doesn't know, until he says her name. Just one word, Mary. And in that moment, recognition hits. So again, ask the question, why does recognition come through voice, action, or personal connection instead of physical appearance? What changed? Because if this were just resurrection in the sense most people imagine, same body, healed wounds back to normal, none of this makes sense. You don't mistake someone you know that well for a stranger. You don't walk for hours without realizing who you're talking to. You don't need a trigger moment to recognize a familiar face, unless the face isn't the same. Now here's where it gets deeper, because the resurrection accounts don't just show recognition problems. They show something else, a different kind of body, a body that appears in locked rooms, a body that vanishes, a body that can be touched, but doesn't behave like ordinary matter. One moment, Jesus is eating with them. The next, he's gone. Doors are locked. And suddenly he's inside. No entry. No transition. Just presence. Then absence. What kind of body does that? It's not purely physical. But it's not purely spiritual either. He eats. He speaks. He can be touched. And yet, he moves beyond physical limitations. So what are we looking at? This is where the idea of a glorified body comes in. But most people hear that phrase and don't really think about what it means. Let's break it down. If the resurrection body is glorified, that implies transformation, not restoration, not repair, transformation, something fundamentally different, a shift in state, a new kind of existence. And if that's true, then recognition wouldn't be automatic, because the reference point, the physical form they knew, is gone, or at least altered. Think about it like this. If you saw someone you knew, but everything about their physical presence had changed, their structure, their expression, their energy, would you immediately recognize them? Or would it take something deeper? A voice, a gesture, a memory, a connection beyond appearance. That's exactly what we see in these encounters. Recognition doesn't come from sight. It comes from relationship. And that raises a bigger question. What if the resurrection wasn't just about coming back to life, but about stepping into a completely different mode of existence? Something that doesn't follow the same biological rules. Something that exists across dimensions we don't fully understand, because the behavior described, appearing, disappearing, passing through barriers, doesn't fit within normal human limitations. It suggests something else, something beyond. And if that's true, then the disciples weren't failing to recognize Jesus. They were encountering something they had no framework for. They were trying to process a reality that didn't match anything they had ever experienced. Their expectations were built on a physical world, but what they were seeing was something that didn't belong entirely to that world anymore. So, let's come back to the core question. Why didn't they recognize him? Was it emotional shock? Maybe. Was it divine intervention? Possibly, but the pattern suggests something deeper, a transformed presence, a body that was real but not bound, visible but not fixed, familiar but not identical. And that changes how you understand the resurrection entirely, because it's not just about life after death. It's about the nature of that life. What does existence look like beyond physical limits? What does identity look like when form changes? And if recognition isn't tied to appearance, then what is it tied to? Connection? Memory? Something deeper than sight? Here's the part most people never stop to consider. Every single recognition moment in these accounts happens through relationship. Mary recognizes him when he speaks her name. The disciples recognize him when he breaks bread. The fishermen recognize him through a familiar act. Not one recognition happens just by looking. Not one. So what does that tell you? Maybe the resurrection isn't just revealing something about Jesus. Maybe it's revealing something about perception itself, about how we recognize truth, about how we identify what's real. Because if you can look directly at something and not understand what you're seeing, then recognition isn't just about vision. It's about awareness. And that leads to one final question. If the people closest to him didn't recognize him at first, what does that say about how we understand things today? What are we looking at, thinking we understand, that we don't actually recognize at all? If this made you think differently, leave a like. If you want more deep breakdowns like this, subscribe. And I want to hear from you. Which moment surprised you the most? Emmaus? Mary at the tomb? The shoreline? Or the idea that recognition itself might not work the way we think it does? Drop it in the comments, because sometimes the biggest truths are the ones hiding in plain sight.